Good afternoon. I'm Bob Anderson, the oldest member of the Anderson family mafia here at this conference. And I have the pleasure this afternoon of bringing you an exciting story of transformation of Arizona from a place for snowbirds from the north and retirees to play golf and work on their tans into a vibrant high technology economy. Don Budinger on my left, a successful business executive and philanthropist, was one of the instigators of this initiative and currently serves as chairman of the Science Foundation of Arizona. Dr. Bill Harris has been recruited as president and CEO to actually make it happen. So to kick it off, Don, why, if it's not broke, did you try to fix it? What did you see that suggested something was missing?
Well, I think the first missing is that it's not apparent that anything's missing. Arizona's a thriving place. After World War II, we had a couple 100,000 people. It's grown to over 6 million. Currently, about 200,000 people a year move there. So all the economic indices always point up. And that's the toughest time to take a look at how you're doing. But about 3 years ago, about 100 thoughtful citizens in politics and business, education, and philanthropy began to meet and ask the question, can Arizona thrive in the 21st century using the same economic model that it built itself with in the 20th century? And the answer to that was no. If you look at the central ingredient, like most places in the South and the West, people came to Arizona with educations paid for by citizens in other states. And they came, if they were a little bit older, with wealth earned with the productivity that existed in other states. And even though the atmosphere was very welcoming and people came to Arizona to start new lives, with what's going on in the world today, the overwhelming thought of this group was that we needed a new model.
Bill, other than the similarities of green emerald rolling hills and 125-degree summers, what kind of things did you find that Ireland and Arizona have in common?
Well, I think the thing that's most in common is that, believe it or not, they're both relatively young states. Though Ireland is an old country historically in Europe, it's become an independent country only in the last less than 100 years. And Arizona is approaching its 100th anniversary in about 5 or 6 years. So I think both countries, because of that, had less constraints to do things and had the ambition to do things in a different way. And both were facing, I think, challenges that they wanted to address. And that's what made the whole thing exciting. My own experience in Ireland for the last 5 years convinced me that the United States was drifting very badly and that Arizona was perhaps one of the few states that had not such entrenched institutions that it might really be able to become a prototype model and be successful in making this transition.
I understand during this time frame, Ireland went from having the worst unemployment rate in Europe to actually having a negative unemployment rate at this stage. What was the secret that drove that extent of economic development?
Well, I think that you got an impression earlier this morning when you had an elected politician from Sweden up here. Leif made one important statement that I think carries over to Ireland and several other European countries, and that's the commitment to education. Most people in the U.S. have forgotten that one of the things that this country did, very, very, very well for many, many years was education. And it was back in the early 1900s when we introduced high school education for the masses. Most countries in the world didn't do that until the 1960s, the mid-1960s. And when we went through World War II and had the GI Bill, our colleges and universities could actually expand and take those GIs because of the high school education, which had been so sound. When I went to Ireland, I had not really spent any time in Ireland before. My life in science had me quite extensively involved in Europe, Japan, and places like that, but Ireland didn't have the science drivers that these other countries did. So when I went to Ireland, I had to learn a lot about the history of Ireland. And one of the things that I learned is in the mid-1960s, they made a couple of very significant decisions. One was open up the high schools for everybody. Another was making sure that you had a very aggressive modern economic development organization called the IDA. And the third thing was to lower the taxes on manufacturing so companies can actually go there. So I think the take-home lesson for that is, number one, Ireland and most European countries take policy making very seriously. They're far more strategic than we are, and they're far more determined to implement the policy. The EU is a good example of that, trying to grow Spain, Portugal, and Ireland to be successful economies. So it's policy and a commitment to policy and a commitment to excellence.
So is that the biggest difference that you saw when you arrived in Arizona?
The biggest difference I saw in Arizona, and I'd say it's not Arizona, I'd say it's the United States. I'd say the difference is the commitment to education, particularly at the K through 12 level. We throw too many people away.
Okay, very good. This foundation is established with $135 million of state money, I understand, matched by industry. Is that correct?
Yeah, let me just give you a little background on this model. One of the things that this group of approximately 100 citizens did is we did a little research. We hired the Battelle Memorial Institute to do a study of bioscience assets in Arizona and where, in that sector of our economy, Arizona stood vis-a-vis the rest of the world. And then a group of 3 CEO organizations put together a team that sent researchers to Ireland, to Boston, to Pittsburgh, to Research Triangle Park, to St. Louis, to San Diego, to Seattle, and to Singapore. We came back and we synthesized the information that these 2 research efforts generated. And essentially the grade that we gave ourselves was we were mediocre. And we had a huge catch-up effort to engage in. So what we did is we entered into a conversation with our elected leaders and said we want to build a new proficiency in Arizona based on scientific, medical, and engineering research and build an infrastructure that can compete with any region in the world. And you can imagine we went through all the, why do we want to do that? We don't need to do that. It's not even moral to do that. It's not proper to do that. But we basically said, hey, look, we are in a different game. We need to behave differently. We need to bring new talents into the state and keep the talent that we have. And we as citizens take the responsibility to work with you as our elected leaders to make this happen. So the model that we put together was a 50-50 match. Half of the money put up of the total of $300 million came from the public side, half came from the private side. And then as a really nice feature, if anybody else wants to try this, 100% of the operating costs to run Science Foundation Arizona are borne by the state's CEOs and their organizations, about 150 companies, so that 100% of money raised to do research goes directly to the research. So that model is currently working its way through the political system. We didn't get a 5-year commitment for the whole thing up front the first year. Last year, we got to go through this drill kind of every year because they want to see how we're doing. They want to see Bill Harris and what he can do in Arizona versus Ireland. They want to see our board of directors. They want to see our investment plan. So we're doing the hard part of it right now, but that's essentially the model.
We heard it from some earlier speakers at this meeting that federal funding is being cut back. It's great to see the industry stepping up and the local government stepping up to the plate. But from my experience, the research side is a good start, but if you're going to turn things into something real, the development commercialization stage usually involves maybe 10 times as much money. How are the successful research efforts, Bill, going to get turned into something that's real and really creates economic development in Arizona?
Well, let me answer that indirectly because that's in the future. I want to go back to the previous group that was up here when they began talking about the United States becoming risk adverse. I think that's a very important thing to understand. We have the impression we're no longer the risk takers, at least I have that impression from being away. And I also would go back to Larry Smarr's comments the other day about the federal government and how the Vannevar Bush model of the endless frontier has really changed, and the priorities are out of balance. The system may be overstressed. The amount of time scientists and engineers now spend writing and reviewing proposals has gone beyond anything that could possibly be considered rational or reasonable. And one of the things that we did in Ireland very aggressively was to try to change the model, to try to give really good scientists enough money so they could take risks. We had a very good board, and that quality, having a very good board that believes in risk-taking, having enough money to make large enough grants so you can actually make a difference, and then connecting them with incentives to industry and reducing the intellectual property barriers produces a huge value. So we demonstrated in Ireland within a 5-year period of time we could create some new models for industries and universities working together that benefited both parties enormously. The Irish government passed laws that actually provided tremendous incentives for exploited intellectual property in Ireland. And we hope to do some of those things in Arizona. Most of the things that we did in Ireland were done by 2 or 3 Americans primarily, who I recruited to help put this together with about 25 Irish people. But the ideas came from our frustration with dealing with the National Science Foundation and the NIH. Despite how good they have been historically, the problems of the last 15 or 20 years are serious for our creative system, I think.
It sounds like you've got the company industrial support and interest. Presumably they want to see something come out of your research labs and we'll do something with it?
Don?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We get asked a lot, who's driving this train here? And the group in front of us, I think, set a wonderful example. This is really being driven at this point in time in Arizona by philanthropy. Yeah. Businesses at the table, education's at the table, the political leadership in the form of our governor, who many of you have met, who are part of Project Inkwell. And we have a progressive, centrist, Democratic leader who gets it and understands it totally. We have a legislature that's split, and frankly, some do and some don't. So the question is, who funds it, who drives it, who leads it, who inspires it? And it's really been driven by the philanthropic community in Arizona. The top 15 foundations in Arizona have corpuses that total $3 billion. And we all work together. And one of the questions that was posed early on was, in addition to what we all do within our own gifting guidelines and what we're trying to do to help the state, what can we do collectively? What perhaps symbiotic effort would result in some larger result than what we're trying to do individually? And the corporate community in Arizona on the research side is thin. We've got a half a dozen fabulous companies, people like Intel and Raytheon. Boeing's there with a large operation in Mesa, which is a suburb. But one of Bill's challenges and jobs will be to connect all the dots, to have the research community in the corporate side and on the education side and on places like TGen and research performing institutions that are standalone entities, all working together. And so the message is sent that Arizona is trying to learn how to compete with other regions of the world that are rich in talent.
Good. I'm impressed that you've gotten, you mentioned there's not 100% of the political system behind you. There's a certain place I'm familiar with, I'm not at liberty to disclose where that is, where political realities watered down high-tech support into things like barbershops and dry cleaning stores. So how do you get the government to realize that maybe you don't get a lot of votes out of the postdocs in nanotechnology, but that this really is the issue for the future of the state as a high-tech, in a high-tech world?
Well, you know, let me go back again to the Larry Smarr comments of last night. I think he is right on target that in the future, the constrained federal budget, and we heard that this morning about the financial analysis for the future, the discretionary part of the federal government, which is where the things like NSF and so forth are going to be squeezed. And it seems to me that what we need to begin looking at are new models that are more effective models to ensure our universities can compete, to ensure that we can find a way to keep the best companies here and growing the best companies here. So the Arizona activity is, I think, an example of one of many states' kinds of activities that's trying to do things in new ways that'll create a more advantageous playing field, if you like, for the research community that's in Arizona. Now, we've only been actually in business about 6 months, and so the kinds of change we'd like to see is still in the future. But the ambition of the state is huge. Now, you've got California, that is a unique institution. California is basically a country almost unto itself, with the quality of its business community, the quality of its universities. And you've got a couple of other states that punch at a pretty good level. But a vast majority of the states are struggling with this issue. They're going from being primarily agricultural economies to a global economy, and I'd say most state legislators are struggling with that issue. One of the things I think that we have to do as a community, whether we're in the research community or whether we're in the philanthropic or business community, we need to spend more time working with the legislators. And one of the things that I've lived in South Carolina, Virginia, and places like this, and I've given talks throughout the states, I find a huge breakdown in the communication between the politicians and the citizens. And I think that what we have tended to do is go to the politicians saying that we need money, or we need this, or we need that, instead of establishing a real dialogue. What I found so refreshing in Ireland was the richness of the political system and the democracy, the way the politicians were engaged actively in the life of the country, if you like. If we had major lecturers, if we had Nobel Prize visitors coming, They would have dinner, they would engage in the conversation, they would know about Science Foundation Ireland. I think we need that same kind of vibrancy in all of the states, not just one or two of the states. And I think the federal government has been such a dominant force in the funding of research since World War II that most states have maybe abrogated their responsibilities to the federal government, have not worried about research. And I think that has weakened the link between industry and the universities, and it's weakened the competitiveness in many of the states at this point.
Don, what have you and your colleagues done to engage the politicians to understand these issues? Because many of them are not scientists. These are difficult things to envision. What's some of the secrets of communicating with them?
Well, I certainly don't have a winning formula. Quite candidly, it's laborious. It's difficult. We have some people who are willing to look beyond their own districts and getting reelected and look to a broader responsibility for the state and the country, and then some, frankly, are not. So we spend a good part of our time in education efforts to share a broader view of the world and how Arizona needs to compete and how that is the best responsibility to take for how we serve our people. But getting past the kind of adolescent model that we're dealing with is a challenge. Not everybody wants to step up to that. And some people feel on one end of the political spectrum, they feel that it's not appropriate for citizens and their leaders to work together, or they don't feel it's appropriate for state money to be used for research. Federal money, maybe, and there's a lot of ignorance about how much federal money actually goes into all of our research institutions. NIH, NSF, and DOD are major funders of most of the important research. I mean, if you want to look at how the internet was originally founded or funded, it was a DARPA project. So I think we need to understand and to embrace the federal contribution, the state contribution, and the citizen contribution. And I think at the end of the day, what it takes is us to take responsibility for the future of our own states and lead our leaders by having them in a conversation they can't escape from.
One of my hobbies is organizational change, and as Bill talked about trying to get the cultures of the academic research community tied in with the industrial community, the political community, the motivations, the metrics are completely different. The industry wants a return on investment and sales growth. The politicians are looking for taxes and job creation. What are some of the cultural things that you guys have bumped into already that
well, you know, I think the cultural things are not unique to Arizona. I think, again, they go across the country. The way the system has evolved, with the federal government being primarily responsible for the research investments, and for the most part since World War II up until maybe a decade or so ago, that was primarily for national security reasons during the Cold War. We often forget a lot of that was done just for the standoff in the bipolar world. And what has happened during that period is that you had one conversation taking place between the federal legislators, if you like, and the research universities and companies of America. You have a very different conversation taking place today. And I think that the conversation that's taking place today is not as substantive as it needs to be. There was a report about a year ago, The Gathering Storm, the National Academies put out, which is a very substantial study. When I was in Ireland, I was asked to review it, and my impression was that the report had identified most of the challenges the country was facing. It identified many of the vulnerabilities, and that the country was at considerable risk from the point of view of national and economic security. And what was a troubling thing is they had an enormous political support building towards this activity, but they weren't able to complete their business this past year. And what we need to do is get a sense of urgency into the process, and we need to maybe modernize some of our thinking and to recognize that there are some other models out there that might teach us something. Again, my own view is we need to distribute some of the responsibility out of D.C. and have some greater partnership between the states and the federal government in terms of getting research done, and become much more strategic rather than ad hoc as we seem to be today.
Don, I know you come out of a high-tech industry. I would suspect that issues like intellectual property, secrecy, these kinds of issues might be a problem in these areas that are working on. Are you running into any issues there with the industrial sector? Are people prepared to be more open and work together more collaboratively?
That's a tough question. I think most of the corporate people in the room would admit that getting the right relationship with universities where who owns the intellectual property is clear, like it would follow the funder, is not the case. What we're doing is we're basically saying that the intellectual property belongs to the inventor. It's not so much who owns it as it is how it's employed. And if responsibility is taken for putting intellectual property in the hands of somebody who can exploit it with a return to the performing institution and the citizens of the state, then you have a win-win. Some of the pushback we've had from our elected leaders has been they think that the state ought to own all the intellectual property. That's the worst place for it to be. It sits on a shelf, it never gets licensed, it never gets exercised. The 12 months runs out, somebody else takes it. I think that the model that we've got is ideal, but it is definitely one that not everybody agrees with.
And I just compliment that point. One of the things that we talked about last year when we were discussing my moving to Arizona was the makeup of the governing board or the board of directors of the foundation. And you're quite familiar with how states tend to operate, and typically they're very much politically appointed boards or representative boards around the state, and you don't get the hard look about what excellence really is or technology. Then you end up at the barbershop or whatever. What Arizona decided to do, and this was led by really the governor and Don, instead of having the governor on the board and the speaker and the president and other representative people, they decided to have a board that was going to be 12 people, half from in the state, of leaders in the state, and half out of state, and to bring in people who would ensure that we focused on excellence, we didn't compromise standards, and that we began to push ourselves very hard going forward. And so I think our experiment, as Don described it, with the public-private partnership, mixture of funding activities, a very, very strong board, it gives us an opportunity to develop an experiment that is worth examining. But I know that Nebraska is trying to do some of this, South Dakota, South Carolina, different states are all looking at things in a different way because they're all struggling with competition. I think it's in our respective interest to figure out how to work together. That really is the secret of how Ireland went from 20% unemployment in 1988 to full employment today, to being 60% of the EU average in salary, to being 140% now, I think. And it's now one of the most expensive places in Europe, if not the most expensive place to be. And you have to ask, why is industry still going there in big ways? It's because it's a good place to do business. They don't go there for the weather, and they don't go there for the Guinness. They go there because it's a good place to do business, and the universities and industry work positively together. And I think that in 1988, the labor unions, the government leaders, the business leaders, the university leaders basically sat around and said, look, this ship is going to keep sinking unless we learn to work together. I think there's a lesson in that for the United States. I think there's a lesson there for each state. We tend to blame things. We tend to blame the school unions, or we tend to blame this or that instead of solving problems. We need to get back to being a problem-solving, can-do nation.
Good. A couple of practical questions. Now you guys benchmarked all the best leading places around the country. You're going to be in competition for the professionals that will staff these various activities down here. What are some of the issues in recruiting staff? And I'm thinking like the quality of the school system. If I'm going to move down there, my kid's going to be in a good school. What's the cultural climate? Can I afford the housing? What are some of those issues?
Yeah, I think there's two key issues. One is the quality of our K-12 system, which is probably a fair word to say is mediocre. We've got a lot of people working on it, but it's not where we need it to be, and that's an issue.
I'd say the whole country is mediocre.
Yeah. And with the exception of the top executive class who would come out who can afford private schools, that's a big issue. The second thing is, in the scientific community area, somebody responding to an offer in Arizona wants to know if there's enough depth within the state that if anything happens to the job they're being offered, after they move their family out there and develop friendships and their kids are in schools there, is there a backup position or two because of the breadth of what's going on? And that, right now, the answer to that's no. Will it change and be different in the future? Yes. But those are probably the two key things that are in the way.
Yeah. And I'd say the other thing we intend to do is use the Science Foundation in Arizona is to create a competitive advantage. So as we recruit people, we can get them set up more quickly than they could in the past, and we can give them a competitive advantage either on the industry side and working with them or the university side.
I'd like to wrap things up by talking a little bit about metrics. How do you know if you win? What's the score? What's the scoreboard? What do you put on the scoreboard? You know, the academics will say it's number of patents and publications, the number of postdocs and so forth, business is going to say return on capital employed, et cetera, et cetera. But as you look at this thing from the broader perspective of all four of the stakeholders, how do you know when you win?
Well, that's a tough question, and that's a fair question. One of the challenges is we're not going to know for a while. And one of our kind of most difficult issues is people are impatient for results. And to do the job properly, for Bill to come into Arizona and do in Arizona what he did in Ireland is going to take longer. And the last thing we want to do is hype anything that we're up to. But I think you will see a few things. I think you're going to see a discussion about something unusual going on in Arizona. I think you're going to see some medical and scientific discoveries that are generated in Arizona that are going to be eye-catching. You saw a couple of them here today in the fire starters. We don't make a claim about the outcome, but we're trying to change the condition that will produce a better outcome.
So we got about 2 minutes left. Final words of advice to the folks here as they go back to their home states to address these kinds of issues?
Well, I think it's important that we all get involved and we not sit back and think that the system that I think is pretty much broken throughout the U.S. is going to fix itself. I think we have to get involved, as Don said, in the political system in a positive way. And we have to get involved locally with our states in terms of who runs for office, who serves, and who cares about the future. I think it's a time of unique opportunity, but I think it's also a time, as some of our speakers have said, of some considerable risk if we don't get involved and make the right choices.
Thank you. We have time for one question. Somebody have a question like that? Please identify yourself.
Quick question, just the price of environmental cost for success. Intel, for example, is building a third fab, for example, in Chandler, and it's in an area that's relatively dry. You get about 7 inches of water, and yet fabs are using incredible amounts of water. You're bringing 10,000 people into the state, but how do you balance that, the environmental cost and the natural resources cost versus the success of a high-tech industry?
Well, that's a question for a whole seminar, and I'm not an expert on Intel's water use in Fab 12 in Chandler, but my understanding is a very significant portion of that is recycled.
Yep.
And that's, that's a place to start. I think Intel's an absolute model of how to behave on the green side.
In the last couple of years, Intel has made major changes in how it operates that Chandler plant. I've actually been down there to see that. But I think that the broader question you're asking is really a question for the West. The West the population is moving to the West. The drought is in its 12th year, I think. And so I'd say that those are all things that we have to begin working more together rather than separately on. And then I'd say the overall pervading or discussion today about the use of solar energy, use of other ways of doing business. I think all of these things are going to be acted on fairly soon because we're going to be forced to act and make decisions. But I think that the Intel thing and all those other activities that are going on in Arizona, there is always a detailed study and an assessment made before those things go in place. But I think you have to balance the environmental issues with how do you use water, how do you preserve water, and how do you get energy in different ways.
Well, let's thank our guests for sharing a very exciting initiative and wish you the very best of success in the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.